to this lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to begin looking at the philosophical topic of the freedom of the will. Now, in general, what I mean by the idea of free will, or the question of free will, is, are we the sorts of beings, are human beings the type of beings that can make free choices, that can decide what to do, who are in control of our own destiny? Or are human beings fundamentally subject to forces outside of our control? Are we being controlled by God? Are we being controlled by nature? Are we being controlled by the physical universe and the nature of causation? At the end of the day, are our actions and our choices up to us, or are they up to something outside of ourselves? Now, this is the general problem of free will, and we're going to be looking at the problem in a number of different ways, and we're going to look at, over the next few videos, a number of different responses to this topic. But what I want to start by doing in this video is just giving some further explanation of why this is a topic that matters. I think when you begin to think about it, you'll see that the topic of free will is one that really touches on matters that are of the most fundamental importance to our lives. Many of the ways that we react to others, many of the ways that we think it makes sense to act, or how we think of our own actions as subject to praise or blame, or even the very simple act of saying I'm sorry, in some sense, sort of rely on this idea that we and other people have free will. So it's a topic that's very important for our own conception of self, for our conception of self as persons who are fundamentally different from other things in the world, and also has a number of very important moral, political, and even religious implications. So I want to draw out some of these implications, explain why the topic is important, before we really get into the details of the argument. Now here I'm relying on Robert Kane's introduction to the problem of free will, and one of the points he makes is that if we think about the various implications or the importance that this problem has, you can see that it has importance for a wide variety of different areas. So on the one hand, he says it has various religious implications. And I think one way to think about this is to think about the famous passage from the Bible which says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." So there's this famous statement about human beings that they're created in the image of God. Now, if it's true that God is responsible for the creation of the universe and everything in it, you might expect that to some extent everything in creation would be a reflection of God. But the claim that human beings are created in the image of God implies an even stronger relation, an even stronger reflection. And it prompts us to ask the question, if you take that statement seriously, it prompts you to ask the question, in what way are human beings similar to God? In the lessons we've looked at thus far, we've talking about God as something outside of space and time, without a beginning, that's infinite, that has complete power and total wisdom. And in those ways, we don't seem very much like God at all. So how is it that you might say human beings are similar, are a reflection or a sort of image of God? Well, the famous philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas explained it in the following way. He said, man is said to be made in the image of God. And why is this? Well, he highlights the fact that what is intellectual and free in choosing and has power in its own right, that is the sense in which we are in the image of God. It remains for us to consider God's image, i.e. man, insofar as he himself is a principle of his own works, in the sense of having free choice and power with respect to those works. So unlike many other entities, many other objects, many other things that exist in the universe, we don't just act, Aquinas says, but we act freely. We are responsible for the things we do. We have this power of free choice. And this gives us a sort of sense of responsibility over our works. So he says that it is because we have free will, because we have freedom, this is one way in which we are a reflection or an image of God. Now, why is this? Well, if God is completely independent, God is responsible for all of creation, there's nothing outside of or more powerful than God, there's nothing that controls God, then you might say God has this sort of ultimate freedom, ultimate independence equaling ultimate freedom. Now, human beings, of course, don't have that sort of freedom. We are subject to many things beyond our control. We're subject to biological realities. We're subject to societal and political realities. We depend on others to survive. But we do have this ability, he thinks, of free choice, of free will. And to that extent, we are fundamentally different than other things in the universe. And to that extent, we somewhat participate, Aquinas thinks, in this freedom of God. So on the one hand, one religious implication is that the concept of free will lies at the very foundation of those who think that humanity is something special, something different than everything else in the universe. Consider also another a religious implication or connection to the problem of free will. So Kane talks about this poem Paradise Lost, which was written by John Milton, where he describes the angels debating how some of them could have sinned of their own free will, given that God had made them intelligent and happy. Why would they have done it? Right? So if God had made these angels intelligent, able to choose well, and happy, well, why have they done what is wrong? And why were they responsible for their sins rather than God, since God had made them the way they were and had complete foreknowledge of what they would do? Think back to the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument, both versions that we looked at, posit a first cause or God as the beginning of the causal chain, right? So the idea is that everything that occurs, every event that occurs has a cause. You can trace those causes all the way back to the beginning. There must have been a first cause, and then you add some argumentation as to why that first cause is God. But if that's true, if God is the spark at the very beginning that gets the whole causal chain of the universe going, then in some sense, everything that happens can be traced back to the choices of God. And if that's the case, then although on the one hand we see that this idea that man is in the image of God relies on our freedom, on the other hand, positing God as creator and controller of the universe might be a threat to our freedom. Because no matter what the choice is, what you're going to have for lunch, where you're going to go to school, whether you're going to lie someone, whether you're going to steal from steal from a store in the mall, no matter what the choice is, if it all goes back in a causal way to God, then would God be responsible? And if God is responsible, can we say that you are morally responsible for your actions? This is actually a very old problem. It's called the problem of divine foreknowledge, and one commentator explains it in this way. Suppose it were known by someone else what you were going to choose to do tomorrow. Wouldn't that entail that tomorrow you must do it? You must do what it was known in advance that you would do. So suppose it is the case that somebody knows that tomorrow you're going to rob a bank. Well, if they actually know that's what you're going to do, wouldn't that mean that you have to rob that bank? Otherwise, they couldn't know you were going to do it. Now, of course, normal human beings don't know what you're going to do in the future in that sense. But remember, God is omniscient. God knows everything. So it's really it's a puzzling question that many theologians, many philosophers have thought about as to how can it be possible that if God knows everything, and therefore God knows what you're going to do tomorrow, how can you be free? If God knows you're going to rob that bank tomorrow, how can you not rob the bank? If God knows you're going to give the charity tomorrow, how can you not give the charity? So this is the problem of divine foreknowledge. And of course, if there's no adequate response to that problem, then many of the things that are said about God and its relationship to humanity seem a little suspect. For instance, if God is seen as a punisher of those who sin or those who do wrong, even ultimate punishments such as sending someone to hell, well, how can that be fair? If you had no choice in the matter as to whether you would lie or rob a bank or do anything else morally wrong or sinful, then how can you be responsible for your actions? How can it be acceptable and just for God to, for instance, send you to hell? So my point here isn't to dive directly into many of these disputes. Philosophers still discuss these questions today, but just to show you that many religious questions, for instance, have a very intimate connection to free will and whether human beings can make their own choices. Let's look at some other implications as well. Kane notes that the question of free will brings up many scientific questions. On the scientific front, issues about free will lead us to ask about the nature of the physical universe and our place in it. Are we determined by physical laws and the movements of atoms? About human psychology, can our actions be predicted by those who know our psychology? And about social conditioning, are we determined to be the kinds of persons we are by hereditary and environment, birth and upbringing? So, if you think about what science does, science attempts to explain the world. And if we can explain the world well, then we can use those explanations to predict the future. So if you know what a gravitational constant is, then you know that when you drop a certain object from a certain height, you know what its speed and velocity is, you know how it's going to act. Well, suppose, if you think about it, we human beings are also part of the physical world. We are also subject to physical laws. We are also subject to the physical laws that govern any material being, and our body is a material being. So given that, and if you say, well, if we could arrive at a very detailed understanding of the brain, would someone be able to predict your behavior from that knowledge? And if your behavior could be predicted from knowing enough about the laws of nature, from knowing enough about your physical body and how it functions, and from knowing enough about how your brain and how human psychology works, if we could predict your behavior, if all of your behavior is caused by those considerations, then how can you be free? Or if you move away from the neuroscientific level to the social scientific level, if we think about all the influences on your behavior, the religious community you were brought up in, who your parents are, who your friends are, what country you're born into, what society you're born into, what you see on TV, the messages you see in media. Think about how your actions may be influenced by things and these sorts of things in all sorts of ways you may not be aware of. So when we start asking about freedom of the will, we are asking a question about to what extent are our actions caused by things outside of us, the sorts of things that science, whether it's the physicists, the neuroscientists, or the social scientists, the sorts of things that science studies, and to what extent can we get past those influences and make our own decisions? And answering these questions has a host of moral and political implications as well. I just previously asked the question, well, if God knows what you're going to do tomorrow, and God knows you're going to do something that's morally wrong, how can you be responsible? Well, now put the problem in a different way. Suppose the reason that you rob that bank tomorrow isn't because God made you do it or because God set the universe up in that way, but it's just because every single action has a cause, and you can trace the causes of your actions all the way back into the past. You were not responsible for all those things that happened in the past. You weren't responsible for who your parents were, what the makeup of your genetic structure is, how you were raised, right? The way your brain operates, way human nature is formed. You weren't responsible for any of that. But if that in fact is what caused you to rob a bank or murder someone or lie to someone, then how can you be morally responsible for what you do? If it wasn't up to you that you were the sort of person who was dishonest or morally corrupt, if that was all beyond your control, if it was just a long string of causes that began way before you even existed, then how can we say that you should be blamed for what you've done? How can we say that you should be punished in a legal sense for what you've done? As we're going to see, there seems to be an intimate and important connection between free will and being blameworthy for doing bad things or being praiseworthy for doing good things. And in large part, I think it's those sort of considerations, the moral considerations, that make people think that the problem of free will is so important, and it's one that's very much worth thinking about and studying. Okay, so these are some of the reasons the problem is important, but before we move on, I also want to say a few things, or we really should give an outline of what do I mean by free will? Because I've sort of been speaking in a very loose way, but I think it's worth breaking it down in more detail. So there are, of course, two components here. There's freedom, and then there's the will. So first, what is the will? So the will just is the capacity to choose a given course of action among a set of possibilities. Right? And you can think about, well, not everything in the universe has this. Like a rock doesn't seem to have it. It doesn't even act at all. A tree acts in a certain sense. It grows, it produces fruit, but it never engages in deliberation. It never thinks, okay, do I want to produce apples today or do I not want to? It just sort of does it by its own internal biology and programming. But then you have other sorts of beings. You have non-human animals of all sorts, from ants to horses to dogs to cats, right? You have all those sorts of beings who seem to act, and to various degrees we think have this ability to make choices. When we look at an ant, we say, well, I'm not sure much is going on in the mind of an ant. When you see something like a horse or a dog, they very much do seem to deliberate and make choices. And then, of course, there's the human being. And the human being also has a will, also has the ability to think about what we do and make choices to the highest degree that at least we are aware of or have encountered to this point. And so we say, the question then is, of all those beings, of all the animals that have a will, do any of them have a free will? That ability to think about what we want to do and make a choice. Is that actually a free choice we're making? Or is it a choice that's been programmed? Because you could even put a computer in this category, right? Computers make choices. They engage in a process of deliberation and make a choice on what to do, but they're just running a program. So the choice isn't free. So what animals make, if any, make free choices? Do human beings do we deliberate and make choices from our own freedom, or are we just running a program that's been installed, so to speak, from our biology, our brain, and our upbringing? So this brings us to the second component. To answer that question, we actually have to know, what do we mean by freedom? Because we accept we have a will, but what does it mean to have a free will? Now, Kane here, I think, helpfully distinguishes between two different senses of freedom. What he calls surface freedom and what he calls deep freedom. Where he says, nothing could be more important than freedom. We talk about it all the time. How it's important politically, morally, how it's something we want to strive, have more freedom in our lives. But he says, why do we want freedom? The simple and not totally adequate answer is that to be free is to be able to satisfy more of our desires. In a free society, we can buy what we want, travel where we please, we can choose what movies to see, what books to read, whom to vote for. So one answer is, yeah, I want to be free because I get to do more of the things I want to do. I get to satisfy more of my desires. But Kane calls this mere surface freedom. And the reason for that is because you can be the sort of person who gets everything you want, and you may not necessarily be free. Now, why is this? Kane explains these freedoms are what you might call surface freedoms. What we mean by free will runs deeper than these ordinary freedoms. Because he says, to see how, suppose we had maximal freedom to make the choices of the kinds just noted, yet the choices we actually made were in fact manipulated by others, by the powers that be. So imagine you lived in a world where you got everything you want, but what you wanted in and of itself wasn't up to you. It was manipulated maybe by the media, maybe by brainwashing from the political elites, maybe brainwashing from your family, your religious community, just your community in general. The reason you wanted the things you wanted wasn't up to your free choice, but it was installed in you like a software program through some sort of manipulation or brainwashing. Kane says, in such a world, we would have a great deal of everyday freedom to do whatever we wanted, yet our freedom of will would be severely limited. We would be free to act or choose what we willed, but we would not have the ultimate power over what it is we willed. Now, what does this mean? This means that you would be able to choose to do what you want, but what you wanted wouldn't be up to you. The choices you made would have been installed by these, what I'm calling elite sort of brainwashers. And to make this point a little clearer, he gives the examples of a couple of stories where this, basically fictional stories where this theme was the central idea of the story. So one of them is the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. The other was Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner. I'll just go over what he says about Walden 2 by Skinner. So Walden 2 imagines this fictional world, and in this fictional world, the desires and purposes of those who live in this community, which is called Walden 2, are also covertly controlled, in this case by behavioral engineers. Citizens of Walden 2 live collectively in what can be described as a rural commune, and because they share duties of farming and raising children, they have plenty of leisure. They pursue arts, sciences, and crafts, engage in musical performances, and enjoy what appears to be a pleasant experience. Indeed, the leading figure of the novel, a fellow named Fraser, who founded Walden 2, forthrightly says their pleasant existence is brought about by the fact that in his community, persons can do whatever they want or choose, because they have been behaviorally conditioned since childhood to want and choose only what they can have and do. Fraser then adds provocatively that in his view, Walden 2 is the freest place on earth, since people there can choose and do anything they want. And he even says that in Walden 2 there's no reason for criminal punishment, because nobody chooses to do the wrong thing because they've been programmed to not want to do the wrong thing. So there's a couple questions here. Would you want to live in Walden 2? I mean, in a certain way, it seems pleasant, right? People engage in a lot of productive and enjoyable activities. They always do whatever they want. And that does indeed seem attractive. At the same time, the only reason that they always do what they want is that they've been programmed to only want what is available to them and to never do anything wrong. And if we think that part of being a person, part of what makes human beings special and particular in a religious context, if you think that what makes human beings special and particular and exceptional is that they're in the image of God, and that image of God comes from the idea that they have free will, then you might say that, well, this is a pleasant and enjoyable experience. It's not a human experience. Maybe you would say it's not an experience I want to live, because even though I get everything I want, I have no control over what I want. And it really gets to this fundamental question: what do we really want out of life? Do we want to have all our desires satisfied? Or do we want to have fundamental control over our fate, control over our destiny? Do we want to feel like we are responsible for the good and the bad things that we do? If you do think the latter things are important, then you might say, well, Walden 2 might be enjoyable, but it's not a full human experience. And if you think Walden 2 would not be a full human experience, then the question of whether we actually do have free will, not in some hypothetical fictional world in a novel, but in the world as it actually is. The question of whether we have free will in this world is supremely important. Because then how you answer that question will determine whether we are essentially automatons or robots who act in a way that's beyond our control, or whether we have fundamental control and responsibility over our own lives. So with these points in place, I think we can spell out a little better what is involved in deep freedom and what is missing with mere surface freedom, with just being free to have what you want. Deep freedom involves two things, and this is really the sort of free will we'll be concerned with in this lesson. First, it involves the ability to rationally deliberate. That means think, have a thought process about what you want to do, and then choose from those alternatives. So we'll call that rational deliberation. Do I want to go have a turkey sandwich for lunch, or a salad, or just skip lunch, right? If you're going through a process of rational deliberation, you're considering those alternatives and choosing one of them. But that's not all you need for this sort of deep freedom. You also need what philosophers in the free will debate call the, quote, ability to do otherwise. Not only do you need the ability to think about what you do and then act on it, but it also had to be possible that you could have done something else. And this is perhaps the most important part of free will. Because if you choose to lie to a friend, if you choose to rob a bank, if you choose to murder someone, but you could not have done otherwise, you did not have the ability to do otherwise, then in fact it seems very weird to say that you did anything wrong, that you should be held responsible for what you did, that you deserve to be blamed or criticized, or you deserve even to be punished. If a murderer could not have done otherwise, if the murderer was determined by forces outside of his or her control to do that action, then how can we say, well, you did the wrong thing, you should have done something else, you should have not murdered, and so we're going to put you in jail? How is that legitimate? It would seem fundamentally unfair. So fundamentally, when we talk about freedom of the will, we're talking about making choices and making them such that you could have done something else. It was possible for you. Now, to see, and I think put a finer point on why this is so important for moral responsibility, I want to end by considering one real-life case where a lot of these issues came to the fore. So it's the case of these two boys, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. So here they are. They were two individuals in the 20s who committed a very horrendous crime. And here's a basic description of what was going on in this case. In 1924, the teenagers Leopold and Loeb kidnapped and murdered a boy named Bobby Franks. Leopold and Loeb were brought up in very rich families, but they were not brought up well. Both had distant fathers, uninvolved mothers, and nannies who were altogether too involved, in Leopold's case sexually. The result was two damaged individuals, despite their intellectual gifts. Had these two never met, they might have made it through life without getting into serious trouble. They might have even grown up at some point and accomplished something worthwhile. But they did meet and became close, but not equal friends. Loeb dominated Leopold, threatening to end their friendship at any sign of resistance to his plans and doling out sex as a reward for acquiescence. Leopold, pathetically grateful to have so dazzling a friend after years of loneliness, was hopelessly infatuated. Individually, they were just a couple of maladjusted, overprivileged college kids. Together they formed a sort of yin and yang of evil. So if you think about just the sort of happenstance or chance circumstances that had to come together to allow this horrific murder and crime to happen. First, both of the boys in this case, both Leopold and Loeb, had certain psychological proclivities to violence, to not understanding the pain and suffering from others, and also to putting themselves in this sort of dominated relationship where they sort of served each other's needs in pursuit of this horrible crime. And if you just don't think of, if you move away from just their psychological state, just the mere fact that these two individuals ended up meeting is really a serious case of misfortune, of very bad luck. So already we can sort of see, if you begin to think about the way in which they were psychologically disposed, the abuse and the bad upbringing that both had, it's very easy to construct a story in which it's hard to blame them in a moral way for what they did. Or at least that was the case made by their lawyer. Now at trial, it was not contested that Leopold and Loeb did the action. It was established and admitted that they did in fact kill Bobby Franks. The only question was, should they receive the death penalty? And their lawyer, Clarence Darrow, gave the following argument for why they should not receive the death penalty. And to understand his argument, it's first helpful to see what he says about the nature of crime itself. Darrow famously said, I really do not in the least believe in crime. I don't believe there's any distinction between the real moral conditions of the people in and out of jail. One is just as good as the other. They are in jail simply because they cannot avoid it on account of circumstances which are entirely beyond their control, for which they are in no way responsible. And you can see how you could come to this conclusion, right? At first, when you hear about a horrible crime, you say, well, how could this person have done this? Why did they make this choice? I would never do anything like this. But then when you think about your own life, and you think about how, and you compare it to their life, and you say, well, there's actually a lot of circumstances that came together that produced this action. Again, Leopold and Loeb had very bad upbringings. They had certain innate psychological tendencies which exposed them to violence. And you might just say, well, it was bad luck on their part that they were born in those circumstances, and very good luck, a very great fortune on my part that I wasn't. And in Darrow's case, he said, in his view, he said, well, this explains why some people are in jail and some are others. Some people are very lucky. They're not born in these circumstances that cause them to do these horrific actions. But other people are born in those circumstances. And he continued on at trial. He gave the following defense of this idea why they should not receive the death penalty. He said, "I do not know what made these boys do this mad act, but I do know there was a reason for it. I know they did not beget themselves." He means that they did not create themselves. They didn't create their psychology. They didn't create the circumstances they were born in. "I know that any one of the infinite number of causes reaching back to the beginning might be working on these boys' minds." What is he talking about, the beginning? The beginning of the universe. The long chain of causal events that started with the Big Bang and brought you to this point right now, none of those were in your control. Yet they all have a profound effect on your behavior. So if we don't create ourselves, if we're not responsible for what puts us in the circumstances we're in life, then how can we be blamed or held fundamentally morally responsible for the things we do, whether good or bad? How can we say that these two individuals deserve to be put to death for a crime that they ultimately could not control? That at least was their lawyer's point. So I'll be very interested to hear what you think about this view of free will, what you think about this conception of crime. Like I said, I'll be interested to discuss that with you. I will cut that video here. I hope it was useful, and I will see you next time.